The forest burned with a light that did not belong to heaven. Flames licked the blackened trunks, and smoke crawled across the ruined fields like something alive. Hans Keller pressed himself against the frozen earth, heart pounding so violently he thought it might betray him to the American patrols moving beyond the trees. His fingers were numb, his rifle slick with mud, and somewhere to his right, someone was praying under their breath. "Keep down," hissed Lieutenant Vogel. His voice was hoarse, worn thin from days without rest. The officer crouched beside a shattered stump, one hand gripping his pistol, the other trembling slightly. His uniform, once immaculate, was torn and filthy, his insignia barely visible under the grime. "They'll sweep the woods before dawn. We move only when I say." Hans nodded, though he barely heard. His ears rang with the echoes of artillery. It had been pounding their retreat for hours, thundering like some furious god over the horizon. The line had collapsed again, another village lost, another promise broken. The Western Front was folding inward, and no one in their small unit believed the radio reports anymore. The Reich, they whispered, was dying. Next to him, Otto pulled the collar of his coat tighter. At 18, he looked older, his jaw shadowed, his eyes bloodshot. "They said we'd be relieved," he muttered. 3 days ago. Relieved? Vogel spat into the dirt. "There's no relief left. Only retreat." Hans glanced at the youngest among them, Eric, a boy of 16 who still carried the hope of propaganda in his eyes. His helmet looked too big for his head, and his rifle trembled in his small hands. Eric's lips moved silently. He wasn't praying for victory. He was praying to go home. A distant explosion rolled through the woods, shaking the ground beneath them. The sky flickered orange and red, lighting the smoke like a furnace. Somewhere far behind the lines, Aachen burned. The Americans were advancing fast, their tanks grinding through villages that only existed as names on maps now. Vogel raised a hand. "Move. North. Stay low." They slithered through the ash and dead leaves, stepping over the twisted bodies of men who had once fought beside them. The stench of cordite and rot hung thick in the air. Hans kept his eyes ahead. If he looked too long, the faces stayed with him when he tried to sleep. The forest thinned near the river. Beyond it, the faint glimmer of headlights moved like ghosts through the fog. Trucks. Allied, by the look of them. Hans froze. Otto crouched beside him, squinting. "They've crossed already." "Then we're surrounded," Vogel said. His voice was flat, without fear, only exhaustion. "If we stay, we die here. We find cover on the ridge and wait for night." They reached a small hollow where a farmhouse once stood, its roof caved in, its walls peppered with bullet holes. Inside, they found what remained of a kitchen, shattered plates, a half-buried photograph of a smiling family, a child's wooden toy. Hans stared at it too long, until Otto kicked a loose board to get his attention. "Don't drift off," Otto said. "We're not ghosts yet." Hans managed a faint smile. "Feels like it." Night came fast. The wind carried the smell of snow. They had no fire, no food beyond a few hard biscuits, and no certainty that anyone even knew they were still alive. Vogel took the first watch, leaning against the window frame with his pistol in his lap. Hans sat beside Eric, who was trying to warm his hands under his coat. "You think they'll shoot us if they catch us?" Eric asked. Hans hesitated. "Maybe not. My brother said the Americans torture prisoners." "Your brother probably never met one." Eric looked at him, then nodded slowly, as though trying to convince himself. "You think we'll get home?" Hans looked toward the window. The distant flashes of artillery strobed like lightning behind the hills. "Home," he murmured. "If it's still there." When his turn for watch came, the world was utterly still. The silence after bombardment was almost worse than the noise, it made every breath sound too loud. He leaned against the wall and drew a small letter from his pocket, worn soft from rereading. His mother's handwriting was elegant, though the ink had smudged where her hand must have trembled. My dear Hans. We are proud of you. The Führer says the tide will turn soon. The city is quiet now, but we pray every day for your victory. Come home soon, my boy. He folded the paper and closed his eyes. Victory. He tried to imagine what that word even meant now. Dawn came with a whisper of engines. Vogel was already awake. Patrol, he murmured. Down the road. They peered through the broken window. American soldiers, half a dozen, maybe more, moved cautiously between the trees. Their helmets were strange and round, their uniforms darker than the German gray. One carried a radio, another scanned the tree line with binoculars. Stay still, Vogel warned. But Eric's boot slipped on the broken floorboards, sending a clatter echoing through the empty house. Instantly, shouts rang out in English. Go! Vogel barked. Gunfire erupted. Glass shattered. Hans hit the ground as bullets tore through the walls. Otto fired a few desperate shots in return, then ducked. They're flanking, he shouted. Vogel turned toward the rear window. Back door. Move. Hans grabbed Eric by the collar, dragging him through the smoke and splinters. The boy's face was pale, his breath ragged. Outside, the cold bit at them like knives. They ran through the orchard behind the house, branches snapping around them as rounds chewed through the air. A shell exploded nearby. The ground lifted beneath them. Hans was thrown hard against a tree, his ears ringing. When he blinked through the haze, he saw Eric sprawled a few meters away, motionless. Eric. He crawled toward him. The boy's leg was torn open, blood soaking through his trousers. His eyes fluttered open, dazed and terrified. It hurts, Eric gasped. Hans pressed a hand over the wound. Stay still. You'll be fine. Eric's hand reached for his sleeve. Don't leave me. I won't. Otto appeared beside them, coughing from the smoke. We have to go. He's hit. Hans shouted. Then carry him. Otto snapped, already reloading. The forest roared again, machine guns barking, trees splintering, men shouting in two languages. Hans hoisted Eric onto his shoulders, staggering under the weight. The boy's blood was warm against his neck. They stumbled downhill toward the river, the sound of pursuit closing in. Vogel covered their retreat, firing in bursts, until the hammer clicked empty. Hans heard him shout something, then a sharp cry, cut short. He didn't look back. By the time they reached the riverbank, the fog was thick enough to hide them. Hans laid Eric down beside the water, his own arms trembling from exhaustion. Otto fell to his knees nearby, gasping. Now what? Hans asked, barely catching his breath. Otto stared at the opposite bank. We swim. Hans looked down at Eric, his face white as the ash drifting through the air. He can't. Otto's voice cracked. Then we stay and die. Hans shook his head. The decision carved itself inside him like a wound. We surrender. Otto's eyes widened. You're out of your mind. They'll kill us if they find us armed. Drop the rifle. I won't give them the satisfaction. Otto's jaw tightened. You know what they'll do to us. Hans didn't answer. He raised his hands slowly, lifting his rifle by the barrel and letting it fall into the mud. The sound felt heavier than the weapon itself. From the mist, a voice called out, firm, commanding, English words they barely understood. Hands up. Don't move. Figures emerged, rifles aimed, faces hidden behind helmets and grime. Hans raised his hands higher. Otto hesitated, gripping his weapon tight. Otto, Hans whispered. Please. The crack of a gunshot shattered the air. Otto dropped to his knees, the rifle falling from his grip, eyes wide with disbelief. He clutched his shoulder, groaning. Hans froze, too stunned to move. An American soldier approached cautiously, weapon trained on them. "Easy," he said, his tone not cruel but wary. "No more shooting." Another knelt beside Eric, checking his pulse. "He's bad," the medic muttered. "Get the stretcher." Hans blinked, unable to process what he was seeing. The man, the enemy, was binding Eric's leg, working fast, his hands sure and practiced. The boy moaned in pain, but the medic's voice softened. "You're okay, kid. We've got you." Hans stared in disbelief. These men were supposed to be monsters. They were supposed to laugh while prisoners suffered. Yet here they were, saving his friend. Vogel was gone. Otto sat in the mud, silent, blood dripping through his fingers. Around them, the Americans moved with precision, efficient but not cruel. One of them, tall, with dark hair and a calm face, met Hans's gaze. "You hurt?" he asked. Hans shook his head slowly. "No." The soldier nodded, lowering his rifle slightly. "Then help us with your friend." Hans did. His hands trembled as he lifted Eric's shoulders, helping the medic strap him onto the stretcher. The boy's breath came in short, shuddering bursts. As they began to move, Hans glanced back at the forest, the smoke rising like ghosts over the trees, the place where his world had burned away. He didn't know if surrender was survival or betrayal. He only knew the war had taken everything familiar, and what replaced it felt strange, fragile, and terrifyingly human. They crossed the field toward the American lines, the sound of boots squelching in the mud, the distant rumble of tanks fading behind them. Hans felt every heartbeat like a hammer in his chest. The sky above was turning pale, streaked with the cold light of morning. Eric stirred on the stretcher, eyes fluttering open. "Are we safe?" he whispered. Hans looked at the soldiers walking beside them, their uniforms foreign, their faces young. "I don't know," he said softly. "But I think they want us alive." Eric tried to smile, then drifted into unconsciousness. When they reached the ridge, Hans turned once more toward the forest. The flames had dimmed, leaving only smoke and silence. He felt something inside him fracture, not fear, not relief, but the realization that everything he had believed about the enemy, about honor, about war, was beginning to unravel. One of the Americans motioned for him to keep walking. Hans obeyed, his hands still raised. The wind carried the faint sound of church bells from a distant village, impossible, haunting, as if the world was already mourning its own dead. For the first time, Hans wondered if mercy could be more terrifying than war itself. And as the sun broke through the smoke, spilling gold across the frozen fields, he realized that surrender was not the end of the battle, only the beginning of understanding it. Mud clung to Hans's boots as they marched, hands bound loosely with rope, through fields soaked in rain and smoke. The American convoy moved steadily east, engines growling, boots squelching in rhythm. The prisoners, no more than a dozen, walked in silence, heads bowed. Behind them, the forest still burned, the faint glow of embers flickering in the gray morning mist. Each step took them farther from the war they had lost, yet closer to a fate they could not name. Eric lay on a stretcher carried by two American medics. His face was pale, lips trembling even in unconsciousness. Hans walked beside him, his gaze darting between the boys' blood-stained bandages and the faces of the soldiers around them. None of the Americans looked cruel. They were young, tired, their uniforms smeared with the same mud as his own. Still, every instinct screamed to distrust them. Otto trudged a few paces behind, his arm bound in a rough sling. He hadn't spoken since the firefight. When their eyes met, he only gave a faint shake of his head, a silent warning, "Don't believe what you see." The convoy reached a temporary camp by dusk, a collection of canvas tents and jeeps huddled in the shadow of a shattered farmhouse. Smoke from field stoves drifted in the cold air. Somewhere, a phonograph crackled faintly, playing a tune Hans didn't recognize. He had expected barbed wire, barking dogs, shouted orders. Instead, a weary-looking sergeant simply gestured toward a fenced area near the edge of the camp. "In there," he said, his accent thick and his tone more tired than harsh. They were ushered inside, a dozen young Germans surrounded by a few quiet guards. The enclosure was little more than a rectangle of wooden posts and wire, with a fire pit in the center and a tarp stretched overhead for shelter. Someone handed Hans a dented tin cup of water. He hesitated, expecting a trick, but thirst won. The water was cold and clean, and he drank until his hands stopped shaking. One of the medics, the one who had knelt by Eric during the capture, approached. He couldn't have been older than 19, his freckles half hidden under grime, a faint scar tracing his jaw. His name tag read Avery. He crouched beside the stretcher, checking the dressing on Eric's leg. "Bad wound," he murmured, almost to himself. "Missed the artery by a miracle." Hans knelt opposite him. "He will live?" Avery looked up, surprised by the English. "If infection doesn't set in, yeah. He's tough for a kid." Hans wanted to ask why he was helping, why an enemy would care. Instead, he watched in silence as Avery cleaned the wound with steady hands. The smell of antiseptic mixed with the metallic tang of blood. Eric groaned softly, his eyes fluttering open. "Water," he whispered in German. Hans held the cup to his lips. Slowly. Eric drank, then glanced weakly at the man beside him. "Is he?" "He's a medic," Hans said. "An American." The boy's brow furrowed, confusion flickering through his pain. "Why?" Hans had no answer. Avery didn't seem to expect one. When he finished, he gave a small nod and rose to his feet. "I'll check him again later," he said. "Get him warm if you can." As he walked away, Otto muttered, "They're soft now. Wait until they take us somewhere real. Then we'll see their mercy." Hans looked at him, tired. He saved Eric's life. "For now," Otto snapped. "You think they'll keep feeding us when they're done? Don't forget who you are." Hans didn't respond. He wasn't sure who he was anymore. That night, the prisoners huddled under the tarp as rain drummed above them. The guards spoke quietly by the fire, their laughter subdued, their exhaustion obvious. Hans couldn't sleep. He listened to the rhythm of the rain and Eric's uneven breathing. Every now and then, a flare lit the horizon, a silent reminder that somewhere, the war still burned. He remembered his mother's letter, the words that once felt like light, "The Führer says the tide will turn soon." He almost laughed. The tide had turned, all right, it had swept them under. Before dawn, Avery returned with another medic, carrying a small tray of supplies. "We're moving wounded to the main station," he said, crouching beside Eric again. "He'll get real treatment there." Hans stiffened. "Where?" "Behind our lines. A few miles." Avery's tone was calm, but his eyes were cautious, as if aware of the fear in the air. "You can come with him if you help carry the stretcher. Deal?" Hans nodded immediately. Otto glared but said nothing. They lifted Eric and followed the medics out of the pen. The guards watched but didn't interfere. The morning was cold and bright, the world painted in frost. The road wound through meadows scarred with shell craters, past the skeletons of burned-out vehicles. Every so often, Hans caught sight of an American convoy, tanks, trucks, ambulances, all moving west. The war machine that had crushed their army now carried its wounded and even their enemies with quiet efficiency. At the field hospital, the air was heavy with disinfectant and groans. Rows of cots filled the tents, each holding a man broken in a different way. Some faces were American, some German, most too young to belong here. Nurses moved between them like ghosts, their expressions unreadable. Avery led Hans and Eric to a corner cot. "Set him here." They lowered the stretcher. A nurse took over, checking Eric's pulse and temperature. Hans stood back, unsure if he was allowed to move. Avery handed him a cup of something steaming. "Coffee," he said. "Or close enough." Hans accepted it with trembling hands. "Why?" he asked quietly. Avery looked at him, brow furrowing. "Why what? Why help us?" The medic hesitated. "Because someone has to stop the bleeding. Doesn't matter whose side." Hans studied him, trying to find deceit in his eyes. There was none. Just fatigue. Compassion, maybe. Or something simpler. "I thought Americans," Hans stopped. He wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. Avery half smiled. "Yeah. I know what you thought." Later, when Eric was asleep and the camp settled into a dull rhythm of routine, Hans found himself watching the Americans more closely. They joked, complained, smoked, and worked. They seemed impossibly normal, men who laughed even as the world crumbled. He envied that. Otto joined him outside the tent, his face hard. "You look at them like they're saints." "They're people," Hans said. "They're killers," Otto hissed. "Don't forget who bombed our cities." Hans didn't argue. He remembered the sound of sirens, the night skies over Hamburg lit like dawn, the ash that fell instead of snow. Otto was right. But still, the sight of the medics treating enemy soldiers unsettled him in ways hatred couldn't reach. That evening, an explosion cracked the air. The ground shuddered. Shouts erupted across the camp. Hans ducked instinctively, heart hammering. Outside, flares lit the sky, a false alarm, they said later. A misfire. But the panic left him trembling long after. When calm returned, Avery came by to check on Eric again. Hans helped him turn the boy gently onto his side. The medic glanced at Hans's hands. "You've done this before?" "Only once," Hans said. "In training." Avery chuckled softly. "Good hands. Maybe when this is over, you should study medicine." Hans stared at him. "When this is over?" The word sounded strange, impossible. Avery shrugged. "Has to end sometime." Hans wanted to believe him. 2 nights later, a cold wind swept through the camp, rattling the canvas. The medics worked through the dark, lanterns flickering over pale faces. Hans was allowed to stay in the tent to help. Eric had developed a fever. The infection Avery had warned of had come. Hours passed in a blur of wet cloths and whispered encouragement. At dawn, the fever broke. Eric lay still, breathing evenly at last. Hans slumped beside the cot, exhausted. Avery stood nearby, rubbing his eyes. "You kept him alive," Hans said quietly. Avery shook his head. "He kept himself alive. You just gave him a reason." Hans looked at him, puzzled. "What reason?" Avery met his gaze. "You didn't leave him behind." Hans didn't know what to say. The medic turned to go, but paused at the tent flap. "You're not what I expected either," he said. "Guess we both learned something." When he left, Hans sat for a long time, listening to Eric's breathing and the distant rumble of artillery far away. The front was moving again, but he no longer cared who advanced or who retreated. All he felt was the faint, bewildering relief that someone had shown them mercy. By the 3rd day, Eric was strong enough to sit up. He stared at the nurse changing his bandage, still incredulous. "They treat us like men," he whispered to Hans. Hans nodded. "Maybe that's the point." Outside, Otto paced near the fence, muttering. He avoided the Americans, his distrust hardening into resentment. But even he accepted the food they were given: bread, soup, coffee. Survival had its own kind of surrender. That evening, as the sky bruised into twilight, Hans stood near the edge of the camp. The horizon glowed faintly where the war still raged. He thought of home, his mother's face, his father's silence, the streets that might now be rubble. The world had been carved in half, and he stood somewhere between guilt and gratitude, unable to choose. Behind him, a voice broke the quiet. "You'll be moved soon," Avery said. "South, to a real POW camp. Safer there." Hans turned. "Will you come?" "Probably not," Avery said. "Front's pushing east. I'll go where the wounded go." Hans hesitated. "Thank you." The medic gave a faint nod, eyes distant. "Take care of your friend. He's lucky to have you." When Avery walked away, the camp lights casting his shadow long against the mud, Hans felt a strange hollowness settle inside him. It wasn't fear this time, it was the slow, fragile birth of something like understanding. Night fell. The prisoners gathered by the small fire, sharing silence more than words. Eric slept peacefully for the first time in days. Otto sat apart, sharpening a stick with a broken knife, muttering about home. Hans looked toward the medical tent where Avery worked under dim light, then back to the fire. The flames flickered low, painting the faces of boys who had once thought themselves soldiers. The rain started again, soft, steady, cleansing. Hans tilted his head upward, letting it run down his face. For the first time since the war began, he did not flinch. He thought of the medic's words, of mercy given without reason, and felt the faint, painful hope that maybe not all battles were fought with guns. In the distance, thunder rolled. Or maybe it was artillery. The difference no longer mattered. When Hans finally lay down beside the dying fire, his last thought before sleep was of Avery's voice, because someone has to stop the bleeding. He wondered if, one day, that would include the wounds they couldn't see. Rain fell steadily over the camp, flattening the mud into a mirror of brown water and sorrow. The makeshift fences sagged under the weight of it, and the air stank of wet wool, rust, and smoke. Hans stood by the latrine trench with a spade in his hands, the handle slick with rain and fatigue. His uniform hung from him like old skin. Each swing of the shovel was a dull rhythm of survival: dig, breathe, endure. Otto worked beside him, his face set in a scowl that had hardened into habit. "We fought for our country," he muttered. "Now we dig their toilets." Hans said nothing. The words were true, and yet they didn't sting the way they once might have. Somewhere behind them, American soldiers laughed, the sound carried faintly through the drizzle. He glanced toward the tents across the yard, where Eric sat under cover, his bandaged leg propped on a crate. The boy had grown quieter since his recovery. He smiled when spoken to, but his eyes were different now, older, uncertain, like someone who had seen too much kindness to keep believing in hate. The days in the camp blended together. Each morning began with orders shouted in English, the prisoners divided into work groups. Some repaired fences, others carried crates, others dug holes that never seemed to fill. It was punishment wrapped as purpose, but the guards were not cruel. They were men doing what war demanded. Among them, Hans often saw Avery. The medic moved between the tents, always carrying that battered satchel, his sleeves rolled up, his hands stained with iodine and fatigue. Sometimes he nodded to Hans across the yard, a wordless acknowledgement of their strange, fragile connection. It was enough. That afternoon, Hans's shovel struck something hard. He knelt, clearing the mud until metal glinted beneath his hands, an old helmet, dented and caked with dirt. He lifted it carefully, turning it over. Inside was a bullet hole clean through the crown. For a moment, he saw his own reflection in the puddle inside the rim. Otto leaned over. "One of ours?" "Maybe," Hans said. "Maybe one of theirs. What does it matter?" Otto spat into the mud. "It matters. We're not the same." Hans looked at him. A hole in the head looks the same, no matter the uniform. Otto's eyes narrowed, but he didn't reply. The rain grew heavier, drowning the silence between them. That evening, the camp buzzed with tension. A supply convoy had been ambushed on the nearby road, and wounded Americans were being brought in on stretchers. The medics shouted orders, the smell of blood cutting through the damp air. Hans saw Avery among them, his face grim, his sleeves soaked crimson. Without thinking, Hans ran toward the medical tent. A guard moved to block him, rifle raised. "I can help," Hans shouted, his voice breaking through the chaos. "I've done it before." The guard hesitated, then waved him through. Inside, the tent was chaos, a symphony of groans and orders, the air thick with sweat and antiseptic. Avery looked up as Hans entered, surprise flickering across his face before relief replaced it. "Good," he said quickly. "Grab those bandages. Keep pressure here." Hans knelt beside a soldier whose chest was half covered in blood. He pressed his hands against the wound as Avery worked, his movements precise and relentless. The American's breath came in shallow bursts, his eyes wild. "Hold steady," Avery murmured. "You're all right, kid." Hans met his eyes, seeing himself reflected in that same desperate gaze. He kept pressing until the bleeding slowed, until Avery nodded and moved on. Hours passed in a blur of red and rain. When it was over, Hans's hands were stained to the wrists. Avery sat heavily on a stool, wiping his face with a sleeve. "You're not bad at this," he said. Hans looked down at his shaking hands. "I didn't think I could do it." "You did." Avery offered him a canteen. "That takes more than training." Hans drank, the water cool against his dry throat. "Why don't you hate us?" he asked suddenly. Avery frowned. "Hate doesn't stop the bleeding." Hans stared at the dirt floor. "It's strange," he said quietly. "To be shown mercy by someone who should want me dead." Avery's voice softened. "You think I haven't lost people? Brothers, friends. I hate the war, not the boys caught in it." Hans met his eyes. "You sound like you believe that." "I have to," Avery said. "Otherwise, none of this means anything." Before Hans could reply, a shout cut through the night. Outside, a guard was dragging a prisoner toward the fence, Otto. His face was twisted in anger, his arm clutched by two Americans. One of them, Corporal Miller, was shouting furiously. "He tried to steal from the kitchen," Miller yelled. "Tried to run when we caught him." Otto struggled, shouting back in German, his voice raw with defiance. The guards forced him to the ground, mud splattering as they wrestled him still. Hans rushed forward, but Avery caught his arm. "Don't. They'll think you're in on it." "He's my friend," Hans said. Avery's grip tightened. "Then don't make it worse." The scene unfolded under the harsh light of a lantern. Miller raised his rifle butt, ready to strike. Avery stepped forward. "Enough." Miller turned, his face flushed. "Stay out of this, medic. He's a thief." "He's a boy," Avery said. "He's scared, hungry. You break his skull, what does that fix?" For a long moment, no one moved. Then the sergeant intervened, barking orders in clipped tones. Miller backed off reluctantly, shoving Otto into the mud one last time. "Next time he steals, he's done." The guards led Otto away. Avery exhaled slowly, his jaw tight. "Your people and mine," he muttered. "We all go mad in the same ways." Hans looked at him, shaken. "You didn't have to stop him." Avery shrugged. "Mercy's cheap until it costs you something." Later, when the camp quieted and the rain eased, Hans found Otto sitting near the fence, his lips split, his uniform soaked. "Why did you do it?" Hans asked softly. Otto stared at the mud. Because I'm tired of being fed by the enemy. Because I wanted to feel like I was still in control of something. You could have been killed. Otto laughed bitterly. Then maybe I'd finally be free. Hans didn't answer. He sat beside him, the night thick with unspoken words. Beyond the fence, the forest whispered in the wind, indifferent to human pain. Days passed. The camp settled back into rhythm, but the air had changed. The guards watched more closely. The prisoners spoke less. Eric spent his days sketching in the dirt with a stick, faces, mostly, and once, a drawing of Avery. Hans worked in the infirmary now, his hands steadier, his eyes dulled by repetition. Each bandage he tied, each wound he cleaned, became a quiet act of atonement. He didn't know for what, perhaps for living when better men had died. One evening, as he carried supplies to the tent, he saw Avery sitting outside, staring at the sky. The medic's uniform was clean, his posture weary. He held a letter, folded and unfolded until the paper had gone soft. Bad news? Hans asked. Avery shook his head. Just, news. My brother's missing in the Ardennes. Hans hesitated. I'm sorry. Avery gave a hollow smile. Maybe he's alive. Maybe he's dead. The war doesn't tell you which until it's too late to care. They sat in silence, the dusk stretching long shadows across the camp. Then Avery said quietly, I wonder if some German medic somewhere is treating him right now. Maybe that's the only way any of us make sense of this, believing someone else is doing what we'd do. Hans thought of the forest, the smoke, the day he had surrendered. Maybe mercy's contagious, he said. Avery looked at him. Then maybe you caught it. Before Hans could respond, the sound of an engine roared in the distance. Headlights cut through the gloom. A jeep raced toward the camp, brakes screeching to a halt. An officer jumped out, shouting orders. The guards scrambled. The prisoners stirred. Word spread fast, an ambush had hit another convoy nearby. More wounded were coming. Within minutes, the quiet camp was a frenzy again. Avery grabbed his satchel. Stay here, he told Hans. But Hans didn't. When the trucks arrived, he was already at the tent, helping unload the stretchers. The first one off made his breath catch. It was Avery, blood soaking through his sleeve, eyes glazed with pain. He dropped the stretcher he was holding and rushed forward. He's hit, he shouted. The medic beside him barked orders. Get him inside. They carried Avery to a cot, the light harsh on his pale face. The wound was deep, shrapnel buried near his ribs. Hans pressed his hands over it, the warmth of blood seeping through his fingers. Stay with me, Hans whispered. Avery's lips twitched into a faint smile. Didn't plan on checking out yet. Don't talk, Hans said. Funny, Avery murmured. Now, you're the medic. Hans's throat tightened. He worked as he had seen Avery work, steady, relentless, refusing to let fear shake his hands. The hours bled together in sweat and silence. Outside, the rain began again, soft as breath. When the bleeding finally stopped, Hans slumped back, exhausted. Avery was unconscious but alive. The other medics moved on to the next patient. Hans sat beside the cot long into the night. He thought of Avery's words, mercy's cheap until it costs you something. He realized now what that meant. Mercy wasn't weakness. It was defiance. A refusal to let war make beasts of men. By morning, the sky cleared. The camp was quiet again, the air washed clean. Avery slept, his chest rising slowly. Hans stepped outside, blinking at the pale light. Across the yard, Otto watched him from the fence, eyes unreadable. Is he going to live? Otto asked. Yes, Hans said. Otto nodded once. Then you've repaid your debt. Hans shook his head. No. I just learned what he already knew. And what's that? Hans looked toward the rising sun. That saving a life feels heavier than taking one. Otto frowned, but said nothing. The camp stirred awake around them, the war creeping ever closer though no one spoke of it. Somewhere beyond the hills, guns still thundered, but here, for a moment, the world was quiet. Hans turned back toward the tent. The cost of mercy was carved into his palms, red and raw, but for the first time he felt the faintest flicker of peace. And in that fragile silence, with the morning breaking over the ruins of the world, he understood, war might teach men how to kill, but mercy taught them how to remain human. The snow came late that year, settling like ash over the camp. It softened the barbed wire, hid the mud, made the world look almost clean again. Hans woke one morning to find the ground white and silent, the air brittle with cold. He stood outside his tent, breath fogging in the dim light, and for a moment he could almost pretend the war had already ended. But the silence wasn't peace, it was waiting. Avery still lay in the infirmary, recovering slowly. His color had returned, though he moved like a man twice his age. The shrapnel had missed his lung by a whisper, and the scar that now cut across his ribs was a reminder of both survival and debt. Hans checked on him every day, bringing water, mending blankets, sitting through long stretches of quiet where neither spoke much. Sometimes Avery would open his eyes and smile faintly. "You're still here," he'd murmur. Hans would nod. "So are you." Outside, rumors swirled through the camp, whispers of Allied advances, of cities falling, of surrender coming soon. Each story spread like wildfire, only to be doused by disbelief. Hope had become a dangerous thing in those final months. Otto, once defiant, grew restless. He paced the perimeter daily, muttering under his breath, staring through the fence as though he could will it to disappear. Eric sketched less and spoke even less. The boy's laughter had gone quiet, replaced by an old man's eyes. One afternoon, Hans found him sitting alone by the water trough, drawing in the frost with a stick. "What are you making?" he asked. Eric didn't look up. "A face I can't remember anymore. My mother's." Hans sat beside him. "You'll see her again." Eric's hand froze. "You really believe that?" Hans wanted to say yes, but the word stuck in his throat. "I have to," he said finally. Eric's stick broke against the frozen ground. "Belief doesn't bring people back." Hans had no answer. The silence stretched between them, fragile as ice. Days turned into weeks. The sound of distant artillery faded, replaced by something stranger, stillness. Then, one morning, the guards called the prisoners into the yard. Their commander, a broad-shouldered man with a weathered face, stood on a crate, a paper trembling in his hands. "The war," he said in a rough voice, "is over." No one moved. The words hung in the air like smoke. Some stared blankly. Others whispered, uncertain whether to cheer or weep. Hans felt the world tilt beneath him. Over? Just like that? After everything? Avery appeared behind the commander, leaning heavily on a cane. His eyes found Hans across the yard, and he gave a faint nod, as if to confirm it was real. The gates didn't open immediately. Orders had to come down, transports arranged, documents signed. But the prisoners could feel the shift, the tension easing, the guards' postures softening. The air itself seemed lighter. That night, the camp was filled with murmured prayers and muffled sobs. Hans lay awake, staring at the canvas above him. Freedom, he realized, was coming, and yet he felt hollow. He thought of the faces he'd left behind in ruined villages, of the men buried in nameless fields, of the blood that still stained his hands. When morning came, he found Avery sitting outside, watching the snow melt under the pale sun. "You should be resting," Hans said. "I've done enough resting," Avery replied. He looked at Hans, studying him quietly. "You don't look happy." Hans hesitated. "I thought I would be. But I don't know what comes next." Avery smiled faintly. "That's the hardest part. Surviving means learning to live again." They sat together in silence, the wind carrying faint birdsong over the wire. Within days, trucks arrived, one for the wounded Americans, one for the German prisoners. The men packed what little they had, their movements slow, uncertain. Erich clutched his notebook like a relic. Otto stood apart, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. As Hans prepared to leave, Avery found him near the fence. His face was pale, but his eyes were steady. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, folded photograph, two boys standing by a barn, one holding a baseball glove. "That's my brother," he said. "The one I told you about." "They found him alive." Hans smiled. "That's good news." Avery nodded. "He'll be coming home. You will too." Hans hesitated, then held out his hand. Avery took it, their grip firm, rough with everything unsaid. "I don't know how to thank you," Hans said. "You already did," Avery replied. "You kept me alive." For a moment, neither let go. Then Avery stepped back, the faintest trace of sadness in his eyes. "Take care of yourself, Hans. The world's going to need men who remember what mercy looks like." Hans swallowed hard. "And what about you?" "I'll keep patching people up," Avery said. "It's what I do." When the trucks started their engines, Hans climbed aboard with the others. As they rolled away from the camp, he looked back one last time. Avery stood at the gate, hand raised in farewell. Then the distance swallowed him. The road stretched endlessly ahead, through snow and mud, through towns that were nothing but skeletons of stone. Some villages welcomed them with bread and silence, others turned away. The prisoners were no longer soldiers, no longer enemies, just men adrift in a world that had forgotten what to do with them. Otto grew quieter as they traveled. One night, by the dying fire, he said, "You think they'll forgive us?" Hans stared into the flames. "No. But maybe we can forgive ourselves." Otto laughed bitterly. "Forgive ourselves for what? For losing?" "For surviving," Hans said. The fire cracked, sparks rising into the dark. Neither spoke again. When they finally reached the repatriation camp, the war felt like a story told by someone else. Papers were signed, names recorded, uniforms taken away. Hans stood in line, waiting for his turn, when a guard handed him a bundle, clean clothes, bread, and a single note written in English. He unfolded it slowly. To Hans Keller. "You once said mercy was strange. Maybe it is. But it's the only thing worth carrying out of this mess. Stay alive. Avery." Hans read it twice, the words burning softly in his chest. He tucked the note into his coat and walked out into the sunlight. The world beyond the camp was scarred but alive. Fields lay fallow, forests burned, rivers swollen with spring melt. He walked for days, through ruins and silence, until he reached a small village at the edge of what had once been Saxony. There, among shattered homes and reborn gardens, he found what was left of his mother's house. The roof had caved in, but the door still stood. He pushed it open, the scent of dust and old wood filling his lungs. In the corner, beneath a blanket of ash, he found a broken frame, the photograph of his family, faces faded but still smiling. He sank to his knees, the note from Avery still in his hand. Outside, the wind moved through the ruins, carrying the distant echo of laughter, of children's voices, of life returning. Days turned into weeks. Hans helped rebuild what he could, mending fences, planting seeds, carrying water from the river. The village was quiet, its people cautious but kind. Every morning, he rose before dawn, staring east as the sky turned gold, and thought of the camp, of Otto, of Erich, of Avery. One morning, he walked to the edge of the field where the frost was melting. He took out Avery's note and read it again. The ink had faded, but the words still held warmth. He whispered to the empty air, "You were right. Mercy's all that's left." Then he folded the note carefully, slipped it back into his pocket, and went on working. Years later, long after the last guns had rusted and the camps had vanished into history, an old man visited that same field. His hair was white, his hands rough with age. He carried a small satchel, a medic's satchel, weathered and worn. Inside it, among faded bandages and cracked glass vials, was a letter written in German. He knelt by the stones that marked the edge of the property and read aloud, voice trembling. Hans Keller. Farmer. Survivor. Friend. Avery smiled faintly, the years sitting heavy on his shoulders. "You made it," he whispered. "You really did." The wind stirred the grass, brushing against his face like an old memory. As the sun dipped behind the hills, Avery closed his eyes and listened, to the faint hum of life, to the silence that had once been war. And in that silence, he heard what they had both fought for, not victory, not vengeance, but the fragile, enduring heartbeat of mercy. The war had ended long ago. But its echo lived on, not in hatred, but in the quiet acts of men who chose compassion over cruelty, healing over harm. For in the end, the battlefield fades. The smoke clears. The metals rust. But the silence remains. And in that silence, mercy endures.